It's the beginning of October. Though there's still plenty of colour on the dahlias in the garden, those of you who've seen my previous videos will know that things are no longer looking at the best. Some plants in particular are showing signs of wear and tear. And my thoughts are turning to how I'm going to store the dahlias over winter. Now, I know that in a good year it's perfectly possible to leave your dahlia tubers in the ground over winter, covering them up to withstand the weather. Now, to be honest, that's not a method I've ever used. So if you're looking for inspiration and advice on how to leave them in the ground over winter and keep them in good condition, I'm afraid you're watching the wrong video. When people come to look at my garden during our open weekend, many people are astounded to hear that I dig them all up and store them in the greenhouse. But that's what I do. And so in this video I'm going to give you an insight into what I do. But before I start, let me give you my usual proviso. This method works for me. It may not necessarily work for you, but it's always worked well for me. There are other methods that other dahlia growers would recommend, which is fine. They've got their own methods which work for them. But I'm only going to talk about the way that I do it. The job starts in mid to late October, depending upon the weather, when I go around and I take off the top half of all the dahlias. And I've put them on the compost heap. Having taken all the flowers off the dahlias, the plants themselves can then put all their efforts into producing bigger and stronger tubers rather than producing more flowers. I'll now leave them like this for a couple of weeks before I start digging them up. In the meantime, the tubers will have time to mature, and in the same time the compost heap should go down quite a lot as the stalks start to rot. By early November we might have had a frost, or there again we might not, but nevertheless by early November it's time to start digging the dahlias up. Now let's be honest, this is quite hard work, so I take my time. I don't rush and do it all in one day. I do this over about a week, digging a few up each day. Chop them off about 4 inches above the ground and then remove all the soil. This takes a bit of time, but the more you can get off before you take them into the greenhouse, the easier job you'll have when it comes to the next step, which is chopping them up. And make sure that you don't lose your labels. I always stick the label into the old mother tuber, which I'll talk about shortly, and that makes sure that you don't lose it. Then take all the tubers into the greenhouse. I'm fortunate I've got quite a large greenhouse with an automatic opening vent, but anywhere where there's a bit of sun and a bit of ventilation will do to help dry them out. I store them upside down so that all the moisture drains out of the tubers, and I'll leave them there for about a couple of weeks. After a week to 10 days of them drying off in the greenhouse, it's now time to start dividing them up, and that in the main means removing the mother tuber, which is most likely to rot over winter. Now, as I demonstrate how I clean and divide the tubers up, I'm going to be talking a lot about the mother tuber. The mother tuber is the one from which the plant directly grew this summer. Now, a tuber only has one season. Once it's produced a shoot, it will wither and dry up or rot. Here's a perfect example. I think you can see that the tubers nearest to me are rotting, whereas the ones on the outside edges are firm and intact. Now, it's important that you remove the mother tuber. Whatever else you do, it's important you remove the mother tuber, because it's going to rot over winter, and that rot could spread to the rest of the tubers in the storage area. Now when you've removed the tuber, there's obviously going to be a wound, but that will seal itself within 2 or 3 days, so that won't be a problem. Now when I look more closely, there are actually 3 mother tubers there, all of which are soft and rotting. I'm going to use this special pair of bonsai scissors to remove them. I've now been round and removed all remnants of those mother tubers. That wound will seal up. Before we store this one for the winter, all we need to do now is to remove any rat's tails, like that one, and also any piggyback tubers, like that one. And finally remove the rest of the stem to about 1 inch above where all the tubers start. And that one's ready now for storage. Finally, I've attached the label. I like to use polypropylene string for this purpose because it doesn't disintegrate. Now this one looks quite straightforward. It appears to have 3 mother tubers in the middle and two relatively new tubers on the outside. So it's a question of removing the mother tubers to start with. So that cuts off the first one, making sure that you remove any residue that will rot. Cut off any rat's tails and piggyback tubers on the ones that you want to keep. So that when it's cleaned up, all I'm left with is the 2 tubers plus the stem. Now you might be surprised to see what I do next. I've found over the years that if you have particularly large tubers, they can be lazy. Any growth that comes from the tubers can rely on that tuber for too long. It doesn't put out any new roots and doesn't grow very tall. So I've found that cutting them off like that and letting the ends heal before you store them is a good way to keep a tuber that size. And dusting the chopped ends with sulphur reduces the chances of rot even more. I do that job outside because I don't like breathing the dust. So I've now completed all the cleaning up work, and as you can see, the pile's considerably smaller than when I started out. I'll leave them on the workbench for about a week, which should be enough time for all the wounds to heal, and then I'll start putting them into the winter storage box. By the end of November, it's time to start putting the dahlias away into the winter storage box. I build a wooden box, and I've lined it with cardboard. And I'm going to store the tubers in potting compost. I've got 2 sorts, one that's got peat in it and this sort that's peat free, and I'm going to mix the 2. Now I'm not telling you that potting compost is the right medium to store dahlia tubers in. Lots of people use different ways. Some people use vermiculite or perlite, others store them in sand, and some people don't use anything at all. They just store them under the staging in the greenhouse and hope that they survive the cold winter. All I can say is that potting compost has always worked pretty well for me. I don't lose so many in the winter. And there are the 2 mixed together. That's a bit on the dry side. I like to keep the compost slightly damp so that the tubers don't dry out over winter. So I'm going to put some water in this. So I've wet it slightly now. Just sufficiently to stick to my hand. And I've now lined the bottom of the box with some compost. Now between now and next March it's unlikely to get very warm in the greenhouse. It might get cold because there's no heat in the greenhouse, so the cardboard and the wood of the box will help protect them from the frost. By putting some compost at the bottom of the box, that should help stop the frost from getting in underneath. So we're now ready for the first layer of dahlia tubers. So there's the first layer of tubers. I left a bit of a gap between the tubers and the cardboard so that I can get more compost down there to make more insulation. I've left the tubers so that the crowns are at the top, that is to say they're all facing upwards. Because if there's a warm spring, they sometimes start to sprout, and if they're upside down they would end up doing a U-turn, which wouldn't do them much good. So there they are, the first layer of tubers now covered up with some more compost. So we're now ready for a second layer of tubers. Second layer done and covered with compost. After that there were 3 more layers. So there they are, all the way in the box, ready for winter. Now I've obviously used quite a lot of potting compost there, but it won't be wasted because of course I'll be growing the tubers in this potting compost again in the spring. So it just remains to put a lid on the box. So that calls for some more cardboard. And finally I make use of some old duvets to give them a cosy covering. The tubers will stay in this box for over 3 months. I won't get them out of storage until the end of March. Though the temperature in the unheated greenhouse is likely to go well below 0, I'm confident that the majority of them will survive the winter.